Department of Health has defined the abuse of children and young people into 4 categories, which are physical, emotional, sexual and neglect. The physical aspect of abuse consisting of assaults and the infliction of pain, injury or death, as well as emotional abuse, which is often inflicted verbally, leading to feelings of inadequacy, shame and living in a state of fear. The sexual abuse of children sees children forced into sexual acts or made to watch these acts take place. Whether the abuse happens alone or has elements of each, the categories symbolise the anguish and lived experience of countless children whose development and quality of life has been adversely affected in some way by the abuse they have suffered. For the purpose of this podcast, I'll focus on neglect, which is known to be the most common form of child abuse in the UK today and is the reason for 60% of all serious case reviews. Neglect is defined by the government as the persistent failure to meet a child's basic and/or psychological need, likely to result in the serious impairment of the child's health or development. Within this definition, a parent or carer may fail to provide a child with clothing, food and shelter sufficient to meet their needs, or exclude a child from having access to home or the care that's needed in order to keep the child safe from physical or emotional harm. The susceptibility of children and babies to abuse and neglect, owing to their age and reliance on adults to care for their needs, leads to them being recognised as vulnerable and requiring protection by law under the Children Act and its subsequent amendments. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child sets out the human rights that children have and the harms which they can expect to be protected from. Article 19 specifically relates to a child's right to live a life which is free from violence of all kinds. Neglect is listed amongst all forms of violent treatment, acknowledging the physical and psychological harm which is caused by it. Presently, cases of neglect can only be prosecuted if they are deemed to be willful acts, yet Action for Children have called for a change to the law which recognises the powerfully damaging impact that acts of omission have on children's lives. There's been widespread research carried out into the effects of neglect on the development of babies. In 1997, Bruce Perry published his explicit photograph, which showed the undeniably visible physical effects that neglect had on the child's developing brain. Since the publication of this picture, it's now understood that in comparison to the other forms of child abuse, neglect leads to the most profound and long-term negative effects on behaviour, educational attainment and emotional well-being. Within the first 2 to 3 years of life, patterns of behaviour are set that are established from a child's expectations of the primary caregiver's response to their needs and environment. In cases of severe neglect, the child will find that he is constantly in a state of hyperarousal as his stress-arousal system begins to form and his basic cries for attention or physical needs continue to be unmet. At this stage of development, the arousal state alerts the developing brain to danger, and this state of fear halts the development of the brain. Continued and persistent deprivation and neglect in turn lead to a child being underdeveloped with limited reasoning and survival-based responses to situations. Because of this, the child will be unable to regulate or reason harmless situations and instead may perceive the world as threatening and dangerous and produce responses which mirror this limited understanding of the world. This effect on the emotional and social development of the child leads to attachment disorders and difficulties in forming relationships. Van der Wert, Marshall, Nelson, Zena and Fox conducted a brain imaging study which showed the resilience of children who were removed from neglectful situations and into nurturing environments before the age of 2. The study revealed that these children were able to successfully catch up to the developmental stage of their peers by the time they'd reached the age of 8. Yet the children whose abuse continued beyond the age of 2 were less able to recover in the long term. The long-term effects of persistent and chronic neglect include mental health issues, suicidal behaviour, panic disorder and antisocial behaviour. A period of brain development which is beginning to be understood as critically as important as the stage between birth and 2 years, yet which has received far less attention, is the phase of adolescence. During adolescence, the prefrontal cortex is maturing at an accelerated rate, and this is the part of the brain that's responsible for the overall control of the stress response system. It's during this important period that young people need increased support to aid their ability to problem solve, make decisions, consider different perspectives and develop appropriate responses to situations. Indeed, between the ages of 10 and 20, the stress and arousal system begins to be mastered. It's essential, therefore, that young people receive the support and care that they need during this phase in order to protect them from the risks that they're otherwise predisposed to. Risks such as suicide, severe neglect, victims of sexual offences, child trafficking and online harm. The NSPCC suggests that the problem of adolescent neglect is a very significant social issue as rising levels of adolescents are finding themselves on child protection plans. In 2011, an Ofsted report described the adolescent years as an age of concern, stating that almost a quarter of all serious case reviews between 2007 and 2011 involved young people over the age of 14. When faced with a complex range of factors at any one time within families, Professor Mike Klein warns social workers that there's a danger in viewing young people as resilient to the effects of neglect and therefore more able to withstand the treatment that they fall victim of. Yet he states that this is simply not the case. The developing brain is where we develop an understanding of abstract thoughts, sexualised behaviour, attachments and our reactions to the emotions we feel. Underestimating the cost of neglect to the child in terms of the lifelong implications associated with it is a huge mistake. This factor is further demonstrated by Smith, Ireland and Thornbury, who found that neglect during adolescence greatly increased a young person's likelihood of engaging in criminality and antisocial behaviour when studied in relation to the peers who had no substantiated experiences of maltreatment. Interestingly, the study found that maltreatment in its various forms, whether sexual, physical or neglectful, appeared to elicit the same outcomes for young people in terms of offending behaviour, substance misuse and violent behaviour. The authors recognised that the young people in the study had internalised their problems and were unable to logically process the issues. The links made in this important study have direct correlations to the physiological changes which are taking place in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for processing problems and solution-based reasoning. Having appropriate guidance and help to understand and process the emerging risks and difficulties associated with entering adulthood is therefore essential to avoid these kind of life-depleting outcomes. The Local Authority Research Consortium echoes this statement, arguing for early intervention in child protection cases involving young people, stating that failing to intervene in a young person's life when help is first needed means that the problem will escalate until the negative outcomes require extremely costly interventions. Arlene Munro's review of child protection cited early intervention as a key factor in protecting children, and this means being able to identify the children who are in need when they need it. And in order for this to do this, having an understanding of the risk factors which will increase the likelihood of neglect taking place is essential. McCoy and Keane draw attention to the usefulness of Bronfenbrenner's systems theory, which takes into consideration the wider context of a young person's life. They warn there's no simple way of detecting whether a child may be more prone to being neglected or abused, but that professionals can begin to consider a wide range of factors in order to help develop an understanding of the level of risk involved in each individual case. The assessment framework typically makes use of Bronfenbrenner's theory and is responsive to the interplay of parental capacity, child's developmental needs, as well as the effects of the wider community that young people grow up in. The assessment framework provides an empirical base for identifying risk factors which may mean that a young person is more predisposed to neglect, factors which relate to family history and functioning elements of the framework, including domestic violence, substance misuse, parental control with little warmth or boundaries, parents with a history of child abuse or who suffer with mental health issues, and single parents who are isolated. Children with disabilities and parents with a learning disability also represent increased risk factors. Munro's review of the child protection system points to her vision for a child-centred system which is fixated on doing the right thing as opposed to doing things right. In the case of working with young people, professionals must take into consideration the likelihood of teenagers engaging with a service, and therefore interventions must be age-specific and responsive to the specific needs of teenagers. A study by the Children's Society found that young people placed high importance on sustainable relationships based on trust and respect, where the young person feels able to make choices. Young people would often rather speak to a peer or a family member than discuss sensitive issues with a professional, and recognising that there may be alternative disclosure networks is therefore essential when considering how and where young people access information and may disclose abuse. Team Around the Child approaches utilise a systems approach to the full and can be useful in creating change and a uniformed approach by all those involved in the child's life. Placing a robust, protective and cohesive system around the adolescent can positively affect the workings of the family and have a positive impact on what may be deep-rooted and lasting family issues. Such approaches recognise the value many young people place on involvement in the third sector, such as local community projects and the youth service. Recognising the wider network involved with young people is therefore essential if effective interventions are to take place. It may be extremely beneficial for professionals to consider the need to cautiously examine their perceptions of neglect. Stein, Rees and Hicks raise the question as to whether it's timely that we consider age-sensitive definitions in order to raise the profile of neglect at this stage of development and to encourage the young people's workforce to be vigilant for the sake of young people who are affected by it. The message from Bruce Perry's research into trauma and resilience is that there is a power in healthy relationships to protect and heal following stress, distress and trauma. As professionals working closely with these young people, we are best placed to believe there is hope and to take heart in Ofsted's findings, which urged professionals to ensure that no matter how hopeless a case may seem, keep going and never give up.